The system didn't collapse with a crash. It turned quietly on a single point. Welcome to Prime Update, where you get new updates every day. This story isn't just about politics. It's about power, pressure, and the moment a system begins to crack, because something happened inside the Canadian Parliament that most people saw as a speech. Markets saw something else entirely. They saw a signal that one of America's closest allies had just executed one of the most elegant diplomatic reversals in modern trade history. And they did it with a single word: pirouette. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament, cameras broadcasting live to every major financial capital on Earth: New York, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo. And he described Canada's entire economic strategy with that single term: pirouette, a dance move, a diplomatic signal, and a direct reference to one of the most famous metaphors in Canadian political history. Carney explained it calmly. Canada was executing a pirouette away from American trade dependency, turning on a single point of strength, using the momentum of Washington's own pressure to complete the rotation, and landing, facing an entirely different direction. The room understood immediately. The markets understood within minutes. And inside the White House, Donald Trump understood it the way someone understands something they fundamentally cannot control: with fury. 14 social media posts in 3 hours. Threats, accusations, warnings of economic war. But there was one thing missing: policy, because rage is easy, strategy is harder. And the word pirouette carried far more weight than it appeared to. To understand why, you need the historical context, because without it, you miss half the meaning of what just happened. Decades ago, Canada's 15th Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, described Canada's relationship with the United States with a metaphor that became famous across diplomatic circles. Living next to America, he said, was like sleeping beside an elephant. No matter how friendly the animal might be, you feel every twitch, every movement, every grunt. That metaphor defined Canadian foreign policy thinking for generations. But Trudeau also proposed a solution. He called it the third option, a strategy designed to reduce Canada's economic dependence on the United States by expanding relationships with Europe, Asia, and emerging markets. And when Trudeau began that shift in the early 1970s, observers used a very specific word to describe the maneuver: a pirouette, a controlled rotation, an elegant turn executed from balance, a movement that changes direction without losing momentum. So when Carney used that word in Parliament, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, it was historical, and it was strategic. Because with that single word, Carney was sending 3 different messages at the same time. To Canadian voters, it said, this strategy has roots, this isn't panic, it's tradition. To international markets, it said, Canada's pivot isn't emotional, it's calculated. And to Washington, it said something much sharper. Canada has done this before. The pirouette is not a crisis response. It is a Canadian tradition. But here's the part that makes this moment explosive. Because the pirouette Carney announced is not just rhetorical, it is operational, a multi-sector rotation of Canada's entire economic posture. Trade, finance, energy, supply chains, all moving simultaneously. And the scale of the shift stunned analysts across global markets. Start with trade. Right now, Canada sends roughly $550 billion in goods and services to the United States every year. That represents about 75% of Canadian exports. It is the most concentrated trade relationship between 2 advanced economies anywhere on Earth. For decades, economists treated that number like geography, something permanent, something unavoidable. Carney treated it differently. He treated it as a policy choice, and policy choices can change. The target he announced inside Parliament shocked the room. Canada will reduce its export dependence on the United States from 75% to 50% within 5 years. Think about that. A 25-point shift in the trade orientation of a G7 economy in 5 years. That is not diversification, that is economic restructuring at wartime speed. Redirecting Canadian exports toward China, India, European markets, and energy partnerships forming across the Gulf states and emerging economies. But trade was only the first layer. The second layer is far more dangerous because it targets the architecture of global finance. Carney announced that all Canadian government procurement contracts with foreign suppliers will now be denominated either in Canadian dollars or the supplier's domestic currency, not US dollars. No exceptions, no grandfather clauses. Every new transaction will be settled through bilateral currency arrangements or sovereign clearing mechanisms outside American financial infrastructure. At the same moment, the Bank of Canada revealed something even more striking: the expansion of bilateral currency swap lines with partner economies. Total liquidity available, $680 billion. That number is not symbolic. It is larger than the foreign exchange reserves of most G20 nations, and it sends a very clear signal. Canada's move away from dollar-dominated trade settlement is not theoretical. It is funded, operational, and ready. Then came the third dimension, energy. And this is where the leverage starts to flip. Carney announced a new national directive establishing the Canadian Energy Diversification Authority. Its mission is simple: reduce the American share of Canadian energy exports from roughly 85% to 60% within 7 years, which sounds modest until you understand how American infrastructure actually works. For 3 decades, refineries across the American Midwest were engineered specifically to process heavy Canadian crude. That supply chain is not flexible. Those refineries cannot simply switch inputs overnight, which means Canada's energy shift doesn't just reduce Canadian dependence, it creates something far more uncomfortable. American dependence, the leverage reverses, quietly, but decisively. Now here's where things start to get volatile. Because the response from Washington revealed something many analysts suspected, but few officials were willing to admit publicly. The leverage may already be gone. Trump's reaction arrived quickly. 14 posts, 3 hours, accusations of betrayal, warnings of tariffs, threats of emergency national security powers. But after the storm of posts, silence. Because somewhere inside the White House, advisors began doing the math, real math, not political math, energy math, trade math, electoral math, and the results were uncomfortable. Consider oil. If Canada diverts even 20% of its oil sands output toward Asian markets through the Trans-Mountain Export Corridor, Midwestern refining capacity immediately faces supply shortages. Gasoline prices rise fast, and the regions that feel that paying first are not coastal elites. They are voters in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the states that decide American presidential elections. So threatening Canada on energy means threatening gas prices in swing states. That strategy collapses under basic electoral arithmetic. The agricultural mirror image is just as dangerous. Canada imports about $40 billion in American agricultural products every year: grain, meat, dairy. If Canada redirects that demand towards suppliers like Brazil, Australia, or New Zealand, American farmers lose a market they cannot easily replace. The American Farm Bureau Federation understands this. Agricultural senators understand this. And the White House understands something even more delicate. Escalating a trade confrontation with Canada could fracture the rural voting coalition that powers American populist politics. Pressure suddenly becomes dangerous for both sides. And then something unexpected happened. A voice from the world of capital entered the conversation: Warren Buffett. His statement arrived only hours after Carney's speech, released through the investor relations channel of Berkshire Hathaway. And when Buffett speaks about long-term economic signals, global markets tend to listen carefully. He said something simple. In 60 years of studying markets, the most reliable predictor of long-term value creation was what he called decisive clarity, the ability to see reality accurately, choose a direction, and execute without hesitation, even when execution creates discomfort. Then Buffett said something analysts are still quoting. Carney had demonstrated decisive clarity at a generational level. He confirmed that Berkshire Hathaway's Canadian exposure had become the largest geographic concentration of the company's international investments outside the United States. And then he delivered the line that changed the tone of the conversation. The pirouette, he said, was not a retreat from the American relationship. It was a renegotiation of that relationship, from a position of strength rather than a position of need. And in 60 years of business, Buffett added, he had never seen a negotiation where the side with alternatives lost to the side without them. At this point in the story, something becomes impossible to ignore. Every tariff Washington imposed over the past 18 months gave Carney political cover to take the next step he was already planning. Every threat accelerated the diversification it was meant to stop. Every escalation gave Canada the justification for moves that would have been politically controversial without external pressure. In other words, Washington unintentionally became the choreographer of the pirouette. The momentum that completed the turn came from the pressure applied against it, and markets reacted instantly. The Canadian dollar surged 3.1% in a single day. The Toronto Stock Exchange hit a new all-time high. Energy producers climbed. Materials companies rallied. Financial institutions surged. Meanwhile, the U.S. dollar index fell sharply. American agricultural futures dropped. Automotive suppliers dependent on Canadian components declined. Energy companies built around stable Canadian crude flows lost value. Markets were not making a political judgment. They were making an economic one. Canada had just become more valuable. America had just become less predictable. Price accordingly. Now pause here for a moment, because what comes next is the part that rarely appears in headlines, but it is circulating inside financial ministries and central banks around the world. If you're finding this analysis valuable and want to keep learning about the hidden forces shaping global events, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to Prime Update. It helps us continue bringing you deeper insights like this. Now let's talk about the part governments are discussing privately. According to an internal analyst briefing circulating through several G7 policy networks, Canada's pivot triggered something unexpected: a strategic countdown. The document warns that global trade architecture could reach a critical decision point within 180 days. The concern is not Canada itself, the concern is demonstration effect. Because once one advanced economy proves that dependence on a dominant partner can be reduced quickly, other countries start asking uncomfortable questions. Finance ministries begin recalculating their trade exposure. Central banks reconsider how much of their reserves must remain in dollars. Energy exporters explore settlement in alternative currencies. And suddenly, a pattern emerges, quietly, systematically. Supply chains begin drifting away from a single gravitational center, not overnight, but steadily. And once that movement reaches critical mass, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse. That is why analysts watching this shift are not focusing only on Canada. They are watching what happens next in Europe, in Asia, in emerging markets, because every government is now asking the same question. If Canada could do this in 18 months, what could we do in 3 years? That question alone introduces a new layer of instability into the global system, not because anyone wants confrontation, but because everyone wants options. And options change negotiations, which brings us back to the present moment. Carney invoked a single word rooted in Canadian political tradition: pirouette. Behind that word now sits a strategy with measurable targets, reducing export dependence on the United States from 75% to 50%, building $680 billion in non-dollar financial infrastructure, redirecting energy flows toward global markets, and quietly shifting the balance of leverage. Trump responded with outrage, but outrage does not change supply chains. It does not rebuild infrastructure, and it does not create alternatives overnight. Buffett called the move decisive clarity. Markets rewarded it immediately, and governments around the world are watching the outcome closely. Because what Canada has demonstrated is something powerful. Economic dependence is not a permanent feature of geography. It is a structure, and structures can change, slowly or suddenly, which leaves the global system facing 3 possible outcomes. First, fragile stability. Canada diversifies gradually. The United States adapts. The relationship stabilizes in a new equilibrium. Trade continues, but the dependency is weaker. Second, serious escalation. Political miscalculation triggers tariffs or retaliation. Supply chains fracture. Markets react violently, and allies discover that economic conflict between partners can spread faster than conflict between rivals. Third, strategic global reset. Other nations quietly follow Canada's example. Trade networks decentralize, financial settlement diversifies, and the economic architecture that dominated the past half-century slowly transforms into something more fragmented. None of these outcomes are completely safe. None guarantee stability, but one thing is already clear. A single word spoken in the Canadian Parliament has forced the global system to confront a new possibility: that the balance of economic power can rotate, slowly, deliberately, like a dancer turning on a single point. So now the question is unavoidable. Was Canada's pirouette simply a calculated act of leadership, or the first signal of a much larger global shift? If this update added value and helped expand your understanding, support the channel. Subscribe to Prime Update and stay informed. Thank you for watching.